Hello, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, we focus on something that you've probably been hearing a lot about in the headlines, sectarianism between Shia and Sunni Muslims. We want to find out what's fueling the conflict between these two sects, especially when it comes to the war in Syria. Is it politics or faith? Malika Bilal is off this week, but filling in as digital producer is our very own Omar Badr. Omar, when you talk about sectarianism on a show like ours, and we have an online community, of course, that is going to be reflected in what the online community is saying about each other and to each other.
Absolutely. It's not a lighthearted subject exactly. And just on the topic, I mean, a lot of the comments that are coming online, many of them are actually sectarian in nature. There's plenty of finger pointing going on, but there are also plenty of people who are blaming sectarianism on politics. If you take a look at my screen, Isabel here says, if it weren't for leaders exploiting uneducated masses, an outdated religious conflict could be substantially abated. Of course, for those of you watching at home, we want you to join the conversation, so be sure to tweet at us using the hashtag AJStream.
Also joining us in the studio, we have Genevieve Abdo, and Genevieve is a fellow in the Middle East program at the Stimson Center. Genevieve wrote a short book for the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings called The New Sectarianism, the Arab Uprisings and the Rebirth of the Shia-Sunni Divide. Now, I can't think of a more relevant short book to have written, Genevieve. It's great to have you in the stream.
Thanks so much, Femi. It's great to be here.
And you'll be hearing more from Genevieve in just a bit.
Hi, my name is Madiha. I'm an independent journalist covering the drone wars in Pakistan, and I'm in the stream.
Is the war in Syria fueling a sectarian conflict beyond its borders? At the end of last year, UN investigators warned of deepening sectarian divides in Syria. They reported a clear shift in the conflict, with both sides describing the civil war in ethnic or religious terms. Sunni fighters have been filtering into Syria to join the rebels in their fight against the Assad regime, while Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia movement, is joining up with government forces. And to add to that mix, the UN also says there are fighters coming into Syria to join up with extremist groups. And sectarianism is on the rise in neighbouring countries as well. In Lebanon, recent clashes between the military and followers of one controversial Sunni cleric left 16 Lebanese soldiers and more than 30 of the cleric's fighters dead. In Egypt, 4 Shia Muslims were beaten to death by Sunni villagers after being accused of spreading Shia Islam. So today we ask, what is driving this rise in sectarianism? Is it politics or faith? To help us explore this, we're joined via Skype by Amr Al-Azam. He's a professor at Shawnee State University and a member of the Syrian opposition. And in our Google Plus Hangout, we have Yusuf Al-Houi, director of the Center for Academic Shia Studies, and Yusuf Bitar, Community Outreach Coordinator for Etilaf. That's the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. It's great to have all of you in the stream. I'm going to start with Amr. Amr, if we look at Syria and we look at the conflict between Sunni and Shias there, in your opinion, what is fueling that conflict?
I mean, essentially, it's a struggle for power, and that's how you have to see this. And, you know, it's easy for us to paint this simply as a sectarian conflict, but it didn't start off like that. And ultimately, the regime is essentially trying to defend its right, or if you want, its grip on power, and the opposition is essentially saying, no, you can't hold on to power for the rest of your existence here. This is not going to work out. So essentially, this is a struggle for power. It is, but the sectarian component, which has crept in, is essentially the fuel that is driving this. And so sectarianism becomes the cover, the excuse, the very essence. It becomes part of the narrative that now both sides are using. And I should point out here that the regime was the one who started this narrative. It started it right from the very beginning. It sought to make this a sectarian narrative because this way it could both justify why it needed to use the excessive force it has been using, and also and make it essentially that this is an existential struggle for their own survival against vastly, remember the regime is Alawite, it's a minority, it's and so this becomes an existential struggle for them against a Sunni majority that they have to defend themselves against, and it draws in other minorities, both in terms of Shiites and Druze and Christians as well. Okay. And so and built that out, and then you have the Sunni majority then saying, well, wait a minute, we're the majority here, and you have this thing sort of then taking a life of its own. But essentially, it is a struggle for power. It's always been a struggle for power, and I would say right from the very beginning, if we consider the struggle between the Umayyads and the supporters of Ali, it was not over doctrinal issues. It was not over how you pray. It was over power. Who gets to rule the caliphate? Is it going to be what we call Ahl al-Bayt, the family of Muhammad, or is it going to be decided by Shura, by whoever gets to make that? Yes.
We're not in one of your lectures today, so I'm going to ask you just to take a breath.
I'm done.
Because otherwise school's going to take a long time today. Whenever anybody says narrative to me, I always really want to know what is going on down on the ground. So Yusuf, if you talk to Shias in Syria, what are they telling you? What is their life like right now?
Well, I would like to differ with my brother Amr and says it wasn't sectarian in nature from the beginning. He must have forgotten the many years of speeches that Sheikh Ar'ur, which is the main leaders of the uprising, has been speaking on satellite stations against Shias. We mustn't forget his original statement that he will mince the Alawites and feed them to the dogs. These are all very, very important statements made by Salafist leaders who see Muslim Shias and Sufi Shias as heretics, who justify violence against them, who justify destroying their shrines, who go around beheading people, teaching their children. This is the ideology which actually, and it was in the interest of people to divide the Syrian people into Sunni and Alawite, so that they can get the Sunni on their side. Let's not forget that Bashar al-Assad, his wife is a Sunni, his children are half Sunni. This is a secular dictatorship. It is not a Shia or Alawite dictatorship.
Okay.
So I say to my brother Amr, it's the people who turned it into Sunni Shia are the people who turned it into sectarian, and not the other way around.
What Sunni wife does not make an Alawite regime, as sort of a mixture. Come on, please.
I lived in Syria.
This is an Alawite regime. It's the officers, the leadership is all Alawite.
But you are not.
The heads of the main levers of power are all in the hands of the Alawites.
Gentlemen,
you're not criticizing them for being dictators. You're criticizing them for being Alawites, and this is where you are being sectarian.
No. I'm not criticizing for being Alawites.
Right, gentlemen, I wanted to.
Point that you just made, where you're saying that the regime is not an Alawite regime, but some sectarian sort of cutting across, all different religions.
All right, Amr and Yusuf, I just want you to just hold tight right now, because I've got Yissa, I've also got Genevieve who want to get in, and also the community as well, because I don't want to spend the whole program talking about Assad's wife and children. So Omar.
We actually have a couple of comments online from people who actually fall on both sides of this. Tess Wagner seems to be agreeing with Amr to some extent, saying that sectarianism divides, often manipulated by those attempting to retain power, and creates a culture of fear and mistrust. She refers to unity as the enemy of dictators. On the other hand, we have Tasman, who frames the conflict in terms of a battle between extremist Wahhabis versus secularists, moderate Sufis, and different people. And we also have an interesting video from Riza, which talks about who actually benefits from sectarianism, and it seems to fall on multiple parts. Take a listen.
The Syrian revolution in origin was not a sectarian uprising. Rather, it was an uprising against an oppressive, secular dictatorship. Syria's regional allies, such as Iran and its proxy Hezbollah, they benefit from framing it as a Sunni versus Shia uprising in order to justify their standing by what otherwise would be an oppressive dictatorship. They can frame it in terms of being an anti-Shia uprising rather than an anti-oppression uprising. On the other hand, the supporters of the uprising, such as Saudi Arabia, also stand to gain from making this into a sectarian uprising, framing it as a sectarian uprising, because they can shift attention from some of the protests against their own government locally onto the Shia minority within Saudi Arabia. So
Genevieve, who benefits from this conflict being more sectarian?
Well, I think that we have maybe one way to sort of get to this point, this very good point that you raised was, is it faith or is it politics? Is it a grab for power? And I think that the two are so intertwined, you can't separate them. So despite what my friend Amr said, I think that we have to also talk about each country individually. So we have to be careful in this conversation not to generalize, because the causes for sectarianism in Syria are quite different, for example, than they are in Bahrain.
So let's do, because we're going to talk about how the sectarianism is spreading across the region, but let's just be very specific about Syria.
Okay. I think, as Amr said, the war began to oust Assad, but people began to identify themselves, which is very important, in whether they were Shia or Sunni, Shia/Alawite or Sunni. And so that became the conflict, and that overwhelmingly spread to other countries. I mean, Lebanon, for example. Lebanon, unfortunately, has now really engaged in this sectarian war. And also, we have to talk about the clerics. They're driving this. They're fueling this. I mean, I visited many mosques in the region recently. And if you look at the sermons that are being said on both sides, if you just take Lebanon as an example, I visited some of the mosques in the Tripoli area. And the sermons are about basically demonizing the Shia and saying, look what the Shia are doing. They're killing all Sunni. If you look at some of the Salafist preachers in Lebanon, a man named Ahmed Asir, there was a lot of violence in Lebanon just last week. And he first started on this sectarian track almost a year ago now, exactly a year ago now. And first the violence was at a low level. He was blocking the highway from Sidon to Beirut. Then it escalated and escalated further. And now we see his supporters are in a confrontation with the Lebanese armed forces. So I think that we can't deny that religion is part of this. It's because it's so clear. Because the clerics have taken this issue to the mosques.
Okay.
And that's what's fueling it.
I can see Yasser frowning on the Google Hangout. Yasser, do jump into the conversation.
I mean, I just have kind of a few points to point out. I do agree with Professor Azam that this was a struggle for democracy against a dictatorship. And I think that's important to understand that this is the essence of what's going on. And this is the youth that began this, calling for freedom and calling for a better future. I do believe that the Syrian regime played the most important role in steering this towards the sectarian, or bringing about these sectarian tensions. From day one, we saw, for example, from the earliest days, the first few weeks of the revolution, we saw the regime make its way into one of the most religiously diverse areas of Syria, known as Jabli, and they would try to plant basically killings between the both sides to frame it as a sectarian uprising rather than an uprising against a dictator. And it's important to understand that this is what the people are calling for, and that the regime used their propaganda as a supposed protector of minority rights. They used specific tactics to push, to ignite these sectarian feelings and to ignite this kind of hatred or tension in the country. We saw the ethnic cleansing going on in various villages with slaughtering and rape and torture. So these are the tactics that the regime used in order to ignite these tensions. And then, of course, the role of the fact that the Assad regime is still in power is what is the key to the fact that this is taking this direction. The fact that there hasn't been a solution, and the fact that the international community has left the Syrian people to fend for themselves with very little support, I believe is what has led to the sectarian tension inside Syria. And then, I mean, I'm not going to, of course, just say that it all has to do with the regime, but going back to the idea of the international community, the people on the ground didn't have their support. So we have a vacuum created for Sunni extremists to make their way in. Sunni extremists, mind you, who are rejected or who were rejected by the Syrian people from the minute that they came into the country. But unfortunately, because of the lack of support to the Syrian people and to the moderate forces, we see that these extremists on both sides, despite the fact that the Sunni extremists are still a minority, but we still see Hezbollah and Iranian forces make their way deeper into Syria.
Omar.
We have a comment here on Facebook from Charles, who says that the Assad family has protected minorities and brought stability to Syria, ending persecution of minority groups by the Sunni majority who are less tolerant of other sects. I want to throw this to Amr. How would you respond to a comment like this?
Well, all I would say to him is that look at the pre-Assad, post-French colonial and the French rule, end of the mandate in 1947, and right up to when the Assads take over, and look at where the sectarian activities really start. It was when Assad took over. Essentially, that's where you start to have this Alawite kind of, if you want, building up that, we need to sort of protect ourselves. And then they co-opted Christians, they co-opted even some Sunnis into their process. But the Sunni population of Syria, and this goes back to a very important aspect. Remember, Syrian society has horizontal and vertical cleavages, and these are well established and well entrenched. Radical extremist thinking, Salafist thinking that our previous one of our colleagues was mentioning is very new and it's very shallow and won't take root. And this is a fairly recent, I think, phenomenon. And in Syria, if it's allowed to, if this conflict is allowed to extend, then we will be, then it may become a problem. But right now, I still think it's too superficial to see it as something that is really, whilst it's a problem right now, I think once this conflict is over, we'll see it dissipate because people will just go back to do what they do before.
Genevieve.
Can I just spot in,
I think that.
Let me just get Genevieve, and then I'll come back to you, Yusuf. Yeah, I see you trying to speak. We'll be with you in a moment. Genevieve.
I think it's quite profound, and I think that the Shia-Sunni conflict is going to be one of the longer-term consequences of the Arab uprisings. If you even look at opinion polling, there was an opinion poll that was conducted recently by the Pew Forum here in Washington, and it indicated that in some countries, Sunnis don't even consider Shia real Muslims. And so I think that we have to look at the conflict historically, that it's been a profound historical problem for centuries in the Middle East. And what happened after the Arab uprisings is that all of these kind of underlying conflicts came to the surface. And this is why I think it's become so explosive, because when you mix into that historical religious conflict the element of power, which we're all talking about, then it becomes really explosive, because it's no longer then just a difference over who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad, but it's about power. And those two, I think, ingredients are causing this whole situation to become very explosive. But I do think it's a very profound thing that's not going to evaporate. If, for example, the problem is solved in Syria, if there's some sort of resolution to the conflict.
Right, and your reference to who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad is about how the Shia and the Sunnis ended up splitting in the first place. And I recommend you do a search engine for that, because we don't have time for that story. But we do have time for Yusuf. Yusuf, please jump in.
Yeah, can I just say, I'm very disappointed with Dr. Amr, Professor Amr, saying this the extremism is superficial.
Yeah.
You have to understand, when it is actually begins to affect people's life, you cannot call it superficial. It may be superficial for you, but not superficial for me. This is the ideology which is killing, bombing people, executing people. They're responsible for destroying a lot of shrines. You still haven't answered me about what Aour has said. It is not clever trying to duck the issue. The issue, we have a serious problem on the ground. That is the Salafist extremist problem, and they are against the Sunnis as much as they are against the Shias. And if you try to tell me that Al-Qaeda and Taliban were superficial, these are people who went around destroying a lot of lives. We are repeating the same mistakes today in Syria by saying it is superficial, but we are funding and supporting groups, Al-Qaeda and the like, who are really dangerous for the Sunnis more than the Shias. And for somebody who is liberal and a professor, I expect you to do better. And
Yusuf, let me answer you right away. No, I'm going to jump in right away and answer Yusuf. First of all, Yusuf, the killing and the destruction you just described is exactly what the regime has been doing. It has destroyed shrines, it has destroyed mosques, it has destroyed churches, it has killed people, it has tortured them. That's exactly what the regime has been doing. Number one. Number two, the extremists that you are talking about, I agree with you. They are a danger to both Sunnis, Muslims, Christians. They're a danger to the entire world. But let's be very frank and clear about those. Those very extreme extremists were those same people, the Al-Qaeda of Syria today, were those very same people that the regime recruited in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 and sent them to Iraq to kill Iraqis, Shiites, Sunnis, Christians, and so on and so forth. And they also used them to kill American US soldiers. And
and Yusuf,
when they rounded them up and put them in jail in Sadnaya, and when this conflict started, they released them. We know them by name, we know them by number. They were released from Sadnaya and sent back out to Syria to do the same thing, so that the regime can then use this as a narrative to essentially justify why it can then use this excessive force against its own people. So your argument is totally bogus.
Actually, your argument works to my advantage, because if the regime sent Al-Qaeda to kill Shias in Iraq, you can't then come back and tell they are Shias. It actually works against you, not for you.
I am calling time on this part of the conversation. Professor Amar and Yusuf, I'm calling time on this part of the conversation because we're hurtling towards the end of the program. We're going to pick up that debate in the post show, but I really do want to squeeze the community in.
Yeah, if we can switch gears to the role of religious leaders. We asked that question online and we got a couple of reactions. Fuad here says religious figures are supposed to unite people, but they actually end up playing a role distancing people from each other. We have another comment from Khalil who says religious leaders are not used to the role of trying to bring people together and are not qualified to intervene in such situations. If I can toss this to Yusr, what do you think what's the role of religious leaders in a situation like this?
Definitely. I mean, actually, to respond to Mr. Yusuf at first, in regards to Aroud, obviously the media is going to bring attention to these extremist voices that kind of resonate with certain populations that sometimes in their rhetoric, although I can truly say with confidence that his rhetoric is not supported by the majority and has never been a part of Syrian society. What about the Islamic leaders such as Sheikh Muhammad Yaqoubi has repeatedly come out speaking against sectarian tensions, or Sheikh Muaz al-Khatib, who was the leader at one point of the Ittilaf in the Syrian opposition. These are the voices, these are the moderate voices that represent the Syrian people. And it's unfortunate that we focus on these extreme voices that do not represent the Syrian people. There are Syrians that have been forced to flee because they spoke out against the regime that can represent it. In regards to your question, the role of religious leaders will be very important post-Assad, or in the transition post-Assad. For example, while I was in Syria or at the border, I met with one of the top religious leaders of the city of Homs, where we see a very ethnically and religiously diverse city. And he mentioned that the role of the majority population, Sunni leaders, will be vital, as they will be able to speak to the youth and to speak to the population that has felt sectarian tensions, and reminded them that we are a population that has lived together for years, and that our job is to look to the future of Syria, work on reconciliation, work on transitional justice, and rebuild Syria, because that's what the goal is. That's what the goal is, for a better Syria for all Syrians at the end of the day. And so these voices resonate with the population, and they must be brought back into the playing field, and most likely that will happen as we transition into a post-Assad Syria, and in the future of Syria, as we kind of lessen the chaos and the feelings of war and the frustration that comes out.
Yes, sir.
Lessens. Yes.
Wonderful. Finish. That's a finish of the end of a sentence, which is the perfect way to end the main show. But it's not the end of the conversation. I mean, we've got centuries of issues to clear up before we end this conversation. Yusuf Al-Khui, Yasser Betta, Genevieve Abdo, Amar Al-Azam, Omar Badar, and the community. To be continued at stream.aljazeera.com. But let me tell you first about the next show. We have spiritual leaders like the Dalai Lama, Sai Baba, and Rumi. They're gurus, they're revered for their wisdom and their spiritual guidance. But are we looking too far outside of ourselves? Maybe we can get guidance from looking inside rather than outside. Are you intrigued? You will be on tomorrow's program. Until then, I'll see you online, stream.aljazeera.com. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We've been talking about something you've been hearing a lot about in the headlines, sectarianism between Shia and Sunni Muslims. And we've been attempting to find out what is fueling the conflict between these two sects, especially when it comes to the war in Syria. Is it politics or faith? To help us do that, we're joined by Genevieve Abdo, a fellow at the Stimson Centre, where she specialises in issues regarding modern Iran and political Islam. On Skype, we have Amr Al-Azm. He's a university professor, a member of the Syrian opposition. And in our Google Plus Hangout, we've got Yusuf Al-Houi. He's director of the Centre for Academic Shia Studies, and Yusuf Bittar, a community outreach coordinator for ETLAF, which is the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. It's great to have you all back here for the post show. Let's see if we can continue the conversation. I think we probably need about 6 more hours, but we'll make do with 10 minutes. In that tiny little gap between the main show and the post show, Genevieve said something about the conversation that we were having, and you characterized it. Can you share it with the rest of our audience? You summed it up as
sort of the display of sectarianism.
Okay.
Not really, but I mean,
don't be embarrassed. You have to say in public.
Do I have to say in public? I told you in private. No, but I would say that not sectarianism, but the difference in the perspective between one of the Shia on the program and the other person who's a Sunni. I mean, there's a completely different perspective, and I think that you see the fierce debate and how emotional even the conversation is on this program. So you can imagine what it is on the ground.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's so I think that it is a deep difference in perspectives.
Yes, but Genevieve, you know that I'm a very secular Sunni.
Yes. No, I understand.
I was born a Sunni.
That makes it more worrying.
Why does it make it more worrying, do you say, Yusuf?
Because I think the whole secular discourse has actually got involved in this. None of them talk about the ethnic cleansing of the Shias in Syria. None of them talk about the beheading. And it's all one-sided. Even Al Jazeera Arabic has been run by many secular Arabs. It speaks very, very sectarian language. And this is extremely worrying, that we have made this issue part of the secular discourse, whereas the secular people should be part of the solution, not part of the problem, not pick and choose what they want to pick and choose. The reality on the ground is that on the ground, a lot of these extremists, which my brother Amr calls superficial, and my sister Yusuf talks about the moderate leaders, but these moderate leaders have actually either been killed, like Sheikh Bouti, by the rebels, or they have no say on the ground. Let us be real. Let us realize that we are repeating the same mistakes as we supporting Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We are supporting something very dangerous.
It's
which
important.
Is not good.
People
if I can just jump in really quickly. Sheikh Bouti, when I speak about moderate leaders, religious leaders, I'm speaking about those in opposition to the regime, that those have an influence on the ground, such as Sheikh Muhammad Yaqoubi and Sheikh Muaz al-Khatib. Sheikh al-Bouti was more or less a mouthpiece for the regime. He was not he was not a moderate
Can I
voice.
interject something?
I've got everybody interjecting, and everybody interjecting doesn't actually quite work out. Okay, so hold on 1 second. So I'm just going to have to call your name and then you can speak.
That has never been the case in Syria. And you must stop doing that, because he does not represent. I am against Araur, I'm against sectarianism, and I denounce it immediately. I have yet to hear you denounce the terrible and violent actions of the regime, for example. I'm sure you do, and I assume that you disagree with that. But
okay, gentlemen, I'm going to let Genevieve into the conversation, which means that you just have to pipe down for a second. Okay, Amr, Yusuf, yes. I understand what you're saying. You can have this same conversation in your own time on Skype. I'm going to move back to Genevieve, though, because we're not making any ground with this conversation. I understand your passion, but let's just move us on a little bit, because time is not our friend today. Genevieve, what do you want to say?
I think that we have to acknowledge, as unfortunate as it is, that the moderates aren't in play here. I mean, as both Amr.
What do you mean by here? Like on this program?
No, I mean, I'm the moderate on this program.
world.
In the world.
Okay.
But I think that, we all want to focus on moderates, but the sad story always is, especially in the Middle East, is that it's not the moderates that drive conflicts. So I think that, as we've all agreed, there are clerics driving the conflict, there are governments driving the conflict. Of course, the Syrian government wants to drive the sectarian conflicts. Of course, the Saudis also drive the sectarian conflict, as do the Bahrainis in Bahrain. The Saudis have their own reasons for wanting their own domestic problems to seem like a sectarian. That can't be denied.
Right.
So I think that we have to talk about what happens sort of on a societal level and what governments are doing as separate conversations.
Sure.
And the two are related, of course, because societies are reacting to what the governments are doing. Of course, the Syrians regime is driving sectarianism, but that doesn't mean that it's artificial, or that doesn't mean that it's not deep. They're just playing on something that has existed for a long time and that has now come to the surface. If you take Iraq, Iraq is being seriously affected by what's happening in Syria, because the Shia feel under siege and the Sunnis have felt to some degree that now they have power again in Iraq because of Syria. They are feeling empowered, as the Sunnis are in Lebanon, because of what's happening in Syria. So I think
the little
that
time we have left, if we can switch the conversation a little bit to moving forward, essentially what the future looks like. I have a very interesting video comment from Haroon from Dubai. Take a listen.
The consequence of allowing this to continue will be the death of Islam as a relevant religious tradition. Because if subsequent generations of Muslims only see in Islam hate, backwardness, and provincialism, they will reject all of it and not just some of it. This is the same thing that happened, frankly, in much of Europe in the 19th and 20th century with Christianity. And we would be foolish to assume that just because we are Muslim, we are somehow immune.
Yusuf, do you see a similar trajectory to what happened in Europe between Protestants and Catholics?
Absolutely. The problem is, as Muslims, we haven't learned the lessons of history. There is a lot of legacy in Europe, and one hand can never clap. Sunnis and Shias are two sides of the same coin, and we must stop all politicians exploiting little religious differences to their advantage.
I am writing that down, Yusuf. One hand can never clap. That is beautiful. I am going to ask you to do something very briefly for me, like we did in the pre-show, which is just, this is such a complex conversation that we've been having. It's such a complex issue. I wanted you all to leave our audience, our viewers, with a very, very clear point that you think it's important that they understand about the Shia and the Sunni conflict in Syria that is beginning to spread around the rest of the Middle East. But just the thought, it's a very quick thought. So, Yusuf, I like the one hand can never clap. I love that. Can I ask Amr, what would be your clarifying thought to leave us with?
My clarifying thought would be that when this uprising started, the very first words that were uttered by these young protesters who came to the streets was "Shab al-Suri wahad." The Syrian people are one. Okay, meaning they're Christians, they're Muslims, they're Shiites, they're Sunnis, they're one. And that was the spirit of the uprising. And that is the spirit that we would want to maintain and we'd want to keep.
Okay, and Yusuf, what is the thought that you're going to leave us with that people go, oh, thank goodness Yusuf said that, I get it now?
I just believe that the key to kind of solving this conflict or lessening the sectarian tensions that are arising in the region, especially within Syria, is to end the conflict itself. And you do that with the support by supporting the moderates. There are moderates on the ground, but they're just not getting supported, whether it be in the Free Syrian Army, whether it be in the civilian governance structures that are popping up all throughout Syria. They just don't have the support or the place to work and kind of prepare for the next step and calm down and work with their population to rebuild their country. They need to be supported in order for the next step to begin.
Okay, and Genevieve?
I think that the Shia-Sunni conflict has already become the central mobilizing force in the Arab world. And I think that going forward, it will replace all other conflicts as the primary conflict. It will replace the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a primary conflict, and it will replace the so-called West versus Islam conflict as the primary dividing, I guess, force.
That's your clarifying thought for us? Now we're all going to be very, very depressed.
Yeah.
but I'm very happy to have had you all on the show. You've really helped just explore this incredibly complex subject. So Yusuf, Yasser, Genevieve and Amra and Omar Buddha and the community, it's been a really, really enlightening conversation. Thank you so much. So what can we possibly do to follow this? Well, on the next show, we're going to be talking about spirituality and spiritual leaders like the Dalai Lama and Sai Baba and Rumi. They're all revered for their wisdom, but perhaps we can find our own spiritual guidance by looking inside rather than outside. We will have that conversation on the next AJ stream. Until then, we will be online. Thanks for watching.